Hello everyone. So today I'm going to talk about presentation details within Sitecore. The goal here is that I haven't really ever shown a course on how to make layout rendering changes to your specific pages within the content editor of the Sitecore shell. Today I'm going to do just that. So to do that, first off, we're working with the example project that I've used in previous videos. The first thing that's really important to know about editing presentation details is that you'll see that I have a home item here, and it represents a template called pages./home. So there's two ways that you can apply presentation details to an item. One is doing it directly to that item, and the other is doing it to its standard values. So as a developer, if you're developing pages for content editors or website owners, you're going to want to make sure that you do these changes ideally to the standard values. For example, if you are wanting to make a change to the home item, you wouldn't want to make that change directly to that home item. You'd want to make it to the standard values of the template of that item. So the home item here has a standard values. Some reasons why you would want to do this. The first, typically you wouldn't want to deploy content changes up to your production environment. So typically as a developer, you're making changes in your local environments and you're not making changes directly on a production environment. So presentation detail changes, you'd want to make them to a template. That template would get packaged up either in an update package if you're using TDS, and those would get deployed up, and that would be part of a deployment. Those template changes would be part of deployment up to production. So that's one reason. Another reason is that it's kind of a best practice to always make changes to the template itself before you make changes to its home item. One caveat to that, however, is that if you're in a production environment and you're wanting to make one specific change to something that wouldn't affect all the pages of that type. For example, if you have a blog article and you want to make a change to one specific article page and not all the article pages, you'd probably want to make that change to that specific article page and not the template standard values. So let's go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Home's template standard values, like I said. So if I go to Example, Pages, and then Home standard values, so that's the standard values item for the home template, which is what we're using on this item here. To get the presentation details, all you have to do is click on an item, go to Presentation, Details under Layout chunk, and this, if you've done training, Sitecore certification training, you may have heard of this called an acronym called PLID, PLD, basically representing presentation, layout, details. And I may have used this acronym in the past. I've kind of tried to move away from using the acronym because it confuses a lot of newbies or users that have never worked with Sitecore before. So I usually try to call it presentation details, just to represent presentation and then details. So what is presentation details? Presentation details is basically where you can define 4 different devices and different layouts, which I'll talk about here in a second. You can define the renderings and rendering parameters and data sources that make up that page. As you can see here, first off, we have 2 different tabs here. One is the shared layout and the other one is the final layout. So what's the difference between that? A final layout is basically going to represent the presentation details for a specific language. So if you're changing the standard values presentation details for the home item and you have selected final layout and you haven't changed the language selector over here, so you have English selected, you're changing the final layout for the English language. Typically, if you're a developer, you're not going to be wanting to make changes to the final layout. You'd really want to make changes to the presentation details for the home standard values item, because this will be, basically you're saying all languages that have this template used will have these presentation detail items defined, or renderings and data sources, etc. defined. The second thing you're going to notice is that there's actually a bunch of devices here, which you can define other devices, and it's kind of uncommon for me to do, but you can define other device configurations. At some point in the future, I'll demonstrate how you would go about creating a new device definition. and then assign things to it, and when you might want to actually go down that situation or path in your own development cycle. I will say one common use for that is mobile. If you have the device detection enabled, such as, if a mobile phone comes to your website and it's detected that it's an Android tablet, you can have a device down here that says mobile, and if it's determined that the phone is mobile, then it will display a completely different set of rendering parameters, or a set of data sources based off that device. I would highly recommend not going down that path. It's better to be responsive versus being adaptive in that sense. That's what I'm kind of describing as adaptive device detection, basically. The issue with being adaptive versus responsive is adaptive is going to require you will have to have multiple differences. You will have a definition for your default, which is anybody, and then you'll have this different definition for your mobile. So you'll basically have two definitions for every type of item that you have in your content tree. That's a lot of maintenance to have to maintain. The best way to handle the whole mobile dilemma is to do responsive, which you would handle from a CSS or front end perspective, and would be outside of most developer or most Sitecore developers' realms, because since most Sitecore developers are back-end developers. If you are a front-end developer, or you are a front-end developer watching this, I would highly recommend focusing on responsive versus adaptive. So if you are looking to do a print specific one, ideally there again, if you're doing print, I would highly recommend that you do a print CSS that controls the controls on the page, and you wouldn't define one separately, a separate device definition. So when you come in here, you have default, and typically if you would never define anything, default would be empty. There's kind of two parts to this. You can click on edit real quick. So once you go in here, you'll start being able to define some of the layouts, the controls, and placeholder settings for this specific presentation details. First thing that you have to define for any page that you want to show content on is going to be a layout. So here you'll see that the only layout I have currently set up for this solution is the basic layout. Just a quick look at that basic layout, if we go back to Visual Studio, is that it consists of just a basic HTML structure. It has a rendering. This was from my course when I did the topic of bundling and minification with .NET. So if you don't know how to do this, just go ahead and watch that video. But really what I'm trying to show is that this main layout, which that layout that I'm specifying is definitely saying, hey, this is the HTML, and it's going to have this HTML placeholder in it. You should always come up with your own naming conventions. I've kind of done this it's kind of a Speak style. Speak has something similar where it uses dots and this kind of specific format. So this is kind of what I've been doing is, so I've defined the main placeholder for my layout is called page.grid. So every rendering that I'm going to place inside this layout is going to use page.grid at its core. As I add more components or renderings to this placeholder, they're going to have their own placeholder keys that I will assign additional components to those placeholder keys, which I'll show here in a second, kind of how that works. And just for those that are watching this and are going, well, what about the experience editor, and why aren't you using that? I'm just trying to demonstrate one path that you would go about defining your page. Now, some people prefer the presentation details. I'm a developer, so that's kind of my preference. And then there's going to be those that they're content editors, they're more basic users, they're going to prefer the experience editor. So that's something to just keep in mind. So I've defined the layout as basic, and now I'm going to go to controls. And so what I was describing before is that because that placeholder key that's defined in that layout is page.grid, anything that you add has to have, at a very starting point, any renderings that you add to this page that has that layout defined has to include one, at least, page.grid. So because I've added a 6x6, which is a bootstrap terminology, basically I'm using a 6 column by 6 column. So there is a left column and a right hand column. And in that, I have included, if we look at that rendering real quick, let's go back to Visual Studio. We'll see I have a 6x6 grid, and it's defined its own placeholder keys of grid 6x6 left and grid 6x6 right. As you can see, I'm saying layout is main or basic. That's actually what I called it. In that basic, I have a placeholder key called page.grid. Now I'm saying add a 6x6 grid into that main layout page.grid placeholder key. Inside of that 6x6, I now have the concept of a grid 6x6 right or 6x6 left. I can say which one do I want to add content to. Let's say I want to add an HTML block to the right 6x6. So I'm saying the column on the right of that 6x6 grid, I'm adding an HTML block to it. So that's pretty much it. So if I wanted to add another HTML block, for example, I can go into grids real quick, HTML block, and now I can add a grid 6x6 left as well. So as you can see there, if I want to add something, I can, basically what it's going to do is show you all the renderings. It's also going to show you sublayouts. I probably discussed this in a previous session, but sublayouts relate to web forms. .NET web forms. If you are unfamiliar with that, don't worry about it. If you've only ever been doing .NET MVC, I would only worry about the renderings. If you've done web forms, you're only going to have sublayouts if you've done sublayouts for your entire site. So you might have a lot more under here if that's what you have been doing. But since you're doing just renderings, and most of my courses are on MVC, .NET MVC, this is where all your controller renderings, either controller rendering or view rendering, are being defined. And then you can come in here and select them. You're just going to find one that you want to place into the page, and you're just going to then specify its placeholder key. So this is the placeholder key that you specify here is what does this component that I'm selecting, HTML block for example, where does this HTML block live? Do I want it to live in the main part of the page? Do I want it to go inside the 6x6 that I already defined? Do I want it, in fact, to maybe go inside another 6x6 if I were to define another one, or an 8x4 or a 12x1 or whatever the combinations may be? Those can all be specified here as a placeholder key that you are adding this component to. You can also open the properties dialog box immediately. I'll show you what this is in a second. So now that we have these defined, let's just kind of cover some of the other things that you can add via the presentation details. First, you can edit an existing item. This will actually bring up the properties for this rendering. So the first thing you'll notice is the placeholder key that we defined previously. It should be listed here. This allows us to change this if we maybe have typed it wrong or things like that. The second thing is a data source. The data source relates to the rendering itself. So when you define a rendering, you can define its data source path and its data source template. So if you do browse here, this one has not been defined as anything, so it's not going to say, oh, this template or this item doesn't match this template, which you can actually set up. So something to keep in mind. There's some settings for caching. Typically, I like to set caching specific to a rendering at the rendering level. So for example, if we are working currently, I believe, on an HTML block, HTML block. You can make this one cacheable. You can say, which I'm going to be doing a video actually in probably either this week or next on HTML caching, on talking about this a little bit further in detail and how to customize this. But if you want to cache this specific component on this page, you can select cacheable, and then you can change these settings to match the scenario that's on the specific page. So like I said, typically you want to cache an entire rendering no matter where it displays. So you can actually change these options on the rendering. I probably have showed that in the past, but if I have not, I'm going to be talking about HTML caching or output caching here in the next week or two. I don't really want caching at this moment. There's some challenges with this, and this will make testing can make testing hard. Please please tune in to my HTML caching one where I'll talk about how to get around some of those things. There's a ability to add additional parameters. These are rendering parameters, but they're loosely named or loosely defined. So basically, it's just a key value pair, which all rendering parameters are just big key value pairs. If you've ever worked with the item API, you'll know that that's basically how they come in anyways. But if you have them strongly defined, you can define additional templates for rendering that says this is the rendering parameters for this rendering, and then you would actually have additional fields here. So this rendering does not have rendering parameters, so you don't see any additional settings here. So that's it for that. Let's see. There's a few other things you can do here. I'm not going to go too much into testing. This is to do with A/B testing. This is where you can set up A/B tests on your rendering, a test per rendering, and then there's also a few other options here. You can remove, so you can delete this. You can move it up and down. For those that haven't worked with my True Dynamic Placeholders component that I put up on the marketplace, it kind of depends a lot on the order. So if you had two 6x6s here, if you had all the grid 6x6 left and rights all under the first 6x6, it would add it to the first 6x6. Whereas if you had another 6x6 here, it would, if you had them in the right order, such as you're saying, oh, I have another 6x6 here, and then there's more HTML blocks underneath it, it would know to add it to that 6x6 above it, not the first one. Does it matter in a normal .NET project or a regular Sitecore project? No, it doesn't. Either with Sitecore 9's new placeholder keys or dynamic placeholders, or with existing placeholder system. The last option is something called personalization. This kind of goes into a more advanced topic, but I will quickly showcase it. This is personalization. Just a few quick reviews of what's going on here. The first thing is if you want to personalize just a type of content that's represented in an HTML block. To do that, you would actually create the plus, and you're just going to give these new definitions or presentation detail or personalization options just a name. So you can just call it option 1. It doesn't really matter. And then basically what you're going to want to do is you can kind of personalize the conditions that would make up and allow option 1 to occur. So the way it works is that if option 1 hits, then it will show this content. Anything that doesn't hit is going to hit default. If you have multiple rules here, it's going to try option 1, option 2, option 3, etc. And then it's going to fall back to the default option. These options are using the rules engine, which I don't know if I've gone to great lengths in explaining how that works, but it allows you to basically define different these are different conditions, and then there's this doesn't really have any actions, but different conditions that you define. Really what you're actually going to be working with more is down here in the visit category. You can actually do ones on profile cards and pattern cards, etc. that says, hey, if the current user is in this pattern card, then, or has this pattern card associated with them, then show them this piece of content, option 1's content, versus the default option. So, and you can do this with GUIP stuff. So if you had the user comes in and they're located in the United States, you can show them one piece of content versus content for the rest of the world kind of scenario. So I'm not going to go too much into that. You can also hide content. So option 1, if the rule is met, then you just hide the block altogether. It just hides it, and then if it's not, then you default it. You can get into some pretty cool, powerful scenarios. One thing to also note is these rules can be you can configure new rules, so you can base them off an external CMS or CRM tool that brings in additional data. Or this also works well with XDB, so you could bring in data from XDB and say, if this data in XDB is visible, then do this type of stuff. So one other thing that you can do is you can actually personalize the presentation of a component, basically meaning you can find a different component. So instead of having it be an HTML block, you could have it be, I don't really have any good components here to show, but I could say make this a comments component. Or you could do some sort of ad for default, but then if the option one hits, you can make it a form where they must fill in a value for that. And you can then set a data source for that as well. So that's just a quick intro into personalization. I probably will cover this a little bit more and kind of show and walk through some of the scenarios that we can really start to show with that personalization, where it can really start to have some value. So you can do some other things. You can move up, move down, rename, delete, etc. So that's pretty much it. I'm not going to go too much more into that. That's pretty much it for presentation details. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me. Questions, please leave comments below. Would really be happy to help answer any of your questions. So, and if you're looking for anything specific, training topics, or even personalized training sessions, please feel free to contact me. I'd love to help you with those topics. So, all right, that's it. Have a good one.